not a lot, but we can have a conversation.
Found a comfortable place to sit. We should get on. As I mentioned to some of you in the other room, I am James Croft, and I am the chair and presently acting director of the Centre for Education Economics. The Centre for Education Economics, for those of you that don't know us, CfEE is an independent think tank that works to improve policy and practice in education through commercial economic research. CfEE researchers monitor, as part of what we do, we monitor global research output in the economics of education. And we produce monthly and annual research digests to disseminate this literature. The Annual Research Digest, which we are launching tomorrow, so we're getting an exclusive 24-hour jump on everybody else, offers leading researchers the opportunity of selecting and commenting on important pieces of research that they think should be brought to wider public notice and discussed more seriously in education and policy circles. This year's Annual Research Digest has been compiled by Lee Crawfurd, who I know is known to many of you. Lee is now Strategic Advisor with the Ministry of Education in Rwanda and the Tony Blair Institute for Global Change. And he's a PhD candidate in economics at the University of Sussex also. He's worked on global development and education policy as a researcher, consultant, and also as a civil servant for over 10 years, and is widely published in peer-reviewed journals. The focus of this year's Annual Research Digest is on research emerging from developing world contexts. One of the things we do in our monthly research digest is we do track that literature, so for those of you who aren't subscribers to that, to get in touch and get you on the list. But this is a fairly new area for us, so happily Lee is up for the challenge, and he's brought together a fantastic team of contributors. Now, developing countries, those below the $12,000 per capita income threshold for rich countries, make up 36% of the world's economy, but 83% of world population and 87% of the world's school pupils. Identifying and tracking the matrix of factors that contribute to this massive waste of human social capital that is implicit in these figures is one of the great challenges of our times, as I know I don't have to tell you. In this research digest, we've asked some leading figures in the field of global education to highlight for us the scope of the challenge and also where reform initiatives have brought benefits. So the digest takes into its purview the state of education provision across developing countries from Asia to Africa, South America, and these commentators offer descriptive analysis of the scale of the crisis, causal studies investigating large-scale system reforms, and new pedagogical approaches, and going beyond task force, studies of the effects of students on socialisation and social mobility. Very pleased to have Lance here with us, and labour of all of this Cambridge assessment, which is my pleasure to do, and also to welcome Bennett Steinberg, who is Group Director of Public Affairs for Cambridge Assessment, who is going to be chairing from a rather interesting angle this lunchtime's proceedings. I'm going to leave Bennett to introduce the panellists, and now I'm going to go over to this chair, where I'm going to try to get the slide transitions right.
Thank you very much, James. I'm Bennett Steinberg, Group Director of Public Affairs at Cambridge Assessment. For those of you who don't know us, we are 160 years old. We're a department of the University of Cambridge, and we produce syllabuses, exams and certificates for school-aged children in 170 countries worldwide. That includes things like international GCSEs, international A-levels, university entrance tests, and of course the ever-important English language provision. Underpinning everything we do is a rather large research capability, and one of the reasons why I'm very, very, very pleased to have sponsored this today is I think these are fascinating papers. I think we've got a really good set of people to talk to these papers, and the quality of the research is exactly the sort of thing that we like to produce ourselves and that we like to support, particularly in relation to countries around the world. So, without further ado, I'm going to introduce Lant Pritchett, who is Professor of the Practice of International Development at Harvard's Kennedy School of Government and is Senior Fellow at the Center for Global Development. Lant, these are all very short introductions. There are longer ones you'll find in the papers you have.
So, I think this is an interesting format of asking people to present what they thought was a really interesting, important paper that wasn't theirs, which for most academics is a very tight constraint. Tend to overinflate the importance of what we're doing, and as director of RISE, which is a large-scale research program which is supported by capita and others, I had multiple examples of research that have been produced in and around RISE to choose from, but I chose this one, which is very simple, but I think illustrates a very deep and important point. So, first slide. Next slide.
Say the magic word.
Yeah, we need a safe word. So, as we're shifting attention in the world of development from merely attaining more and more great attainment to actually achieving learning goals, it turns out any given learning goal can be roughly decomposed in a very useful way, which is if we want to know the fraction of population that are above some threshold in numeracy and literacy and any capability we want to think of, it can be exactly decomposed into the fraction of the population that has achieved a given grade and the sort of level of skill of people that achieve that grade. So the level of skill or capability that was achieved at any given grade of the population when you assess a cohort is what we call a learning profile. A learning profile is just a descriptive device where we take people, we ask them something that assesses their capability, we stratify by the level of schooling they've completed, and we can measure sort of what they, typically know at any given grade. And arithmetically, again, if we take a cohort and say we want the cohort to be able to do X, that cohort goal can just be decomposed into the attainment of the cohort times the learning profile of the cohort in just a, simple just adding up. Next slide. So the key question is, can one actually achieve learning goals that we might have, including the Sustainable Development Goal of universal literacy, in what way? And if you think about a crude metaphor, you're walking out a path, and how steep that path is determines how far you have to walk to get a certain height. So if you're walking along a very shallow path, you can walk a long ways and not be very high. If you're walking a steep path, you have to walk less horizontal the distance to get the same shockingly shallow, meaning kids are just learning shockingly little per year of schooling. So this is a paper of mine, just one slide. But we just took the demographic and health survey that has comparable surveys for 54 different countries around the world. And in each of them, we just took a cohort of adult women who were asked to read a simple sentence in the language of their choosing. And this is the fraction of women who could read the sentence by the grade they completed. So of women who had completed 6th grade of education, in Nigeria, 11% could read a single simple sentence like farming is hard work. This is not literacy, this is not mastery, this is not functional, this is just, can you read this single simple sentence out loud? 11% in Nigeria, 97% in Rwanda. The average around the world was, of the 51 countries that we could compute this profile for, was 50%. Half of all adult women who completed grade 6 could read a single sentence. So achieving universal primary schooling, on average, it would leave half of children illiterate at those profiles. Okay, so the interesting thing about the current paper, next, is it does this back, not forward, sorry. Oh, still going forward? Okay, there we go. It took a large, reasonably nationally representative sample from Indonesia. That was a panel survey, so they have been going back to the same households really since the 1990s, but they're only using the surveys of 2000 and 2014, although they have 2007 in between. So we are able to measure not just the learning profile, but we can directly measure progress in the cohort achievement. We can say, of a cohort of 18 to 24-year-olds in 2000, how many of them had these skills, and how much did that change by 2014? And we can measure it directly, and then we can decompose progress between how much schooling went up and what happened to the learning profile. And these are like super simple arithmetic questions answered in a multiple choice format. So it's, reducing 56/84 to the fraction 2/3. And these are things that are expected to be taught and achieved in early grades of primary. So it's not subtle or sophisticated assessment of the type Cambridge is called upon to do. This is really just super simple arithmetic skills assessed in the most brutally simple possible way. And even the questions that look relatively complex, actually, of the multiple choice are super easy. So what they did is they computed the percent correct for each of these questions. They computed an IRT index of that, and the results are here. Next slide. And this just basically shows the decomposition, which is, this shows how schooling changed. So many fewer children had lower, only primary, many more children had senior secondary complete. 1 out of every 5, there was an increase of 20 percentage points in the fraction of the cohort with secondary school or higher complete. So a massive increase, basically, in schooling completed. And the blue line is the learning profile. And the learning profile, and this is one of the reasons I find this paper striking is that I have lived in Indonesia. Indonesia is a middle-income country, and income per capita in this period doubled. It's a functional, thriving country in many, many ways. But this is the learning profile. Basically, between primary schooling, next slide, between primary schooling and senior secondary or higher, and there's some beyond senior secondary, the percent correct on these simple questions will increase by 18 percentage points. So basically, 20% of kids got these right, and 20% of kids got these right. Even with just primary school, only about 40% of them got it right, having completed 12 years of schooling, which is just shocking. What's even more shocking, and therefore, by the way, pushing kids along this profile just doesn't do you that much good. So what we would have expected is, even had the profile profile stayed flat, we would have only increased the fraction of the cohort that could answer a typical arithmetic question correctly by 3.6%. 20% more of the population completing senior secondary, 3.6% improvement in their numeracy in the percent correct we would expect on some simple arithmetic. Just amazingly little progress because you're just pushing out a very shallow ramp, essentially. What's worse, next slide, is it got worse. So the learning profile over these 14 years fell. So at each level of schooling completed, kids in this cohort were less likely to answer the questions correctly in 2014 than they were in 2000. So cohort of age 18 to 14, 2000, cohort of 18 to 14, 2014. At each level of schooling, they knew less arithmetic or could answer these questions correctly, which means, next slide, the net total improvement in the cohort's ability to have numeracy by this crude measure went up by 0.02%. That's not 2%. That's 0.02%. Which means if we wanted, say, these youth to be ready for the 21st century, at this pace of improvement of progress of 0.02% every 14 years, by the 31st century, you would have half of the children being able to, they would get 50% right on this kind of thing. So you'd be ready for the 21st century in the 31st. It's just unbelievably slow progress, in part because we slipped backwards. So had we maintained the profile, it would have been 34.7, but instead the deterioration in the profile meant we pushed up. 1 in 5 more kids completed senior secondary, and yet 0.02% improvement, in part because they knew less having gone through schooling, and in part just because it wasn't going to be that big anyway because it was so flat. So the upshot is, the reason I'm focusing on this paper as being super important is that Indonesia is a great country. I love Indonesia. Indonesia is not a crisis country. It's not a conflict country. Its government works in every respect. If anywhere in the world you might have expected kind of progress, Indonesia is one of those places where you say, it's kind of a functional happening place. By the way, they tripled the per student budget over this period. Tripled. Like, not 30%, tripled. The risk about what we're doing is complacency, in my mind, which is just kind of, I think a lot of people think, once we focus on the learning goal, it'll be relatively easy to attain, and we'll just focus on it and it'll happen. Indonesia's kind of been focused on it, been doing a lot of things people would have said were the right thing to do, and yet, like, zero progress. So we're not, in this country in particular, which is a country of 250 million or more people, which is important in its own right, but even more, it's an otherwise quite functional country. We have not even turned the corner on accelerating the progress of learning. It's not even positive yet, much less anything like the pace of progress one would need to get to anything like the goals for learning that I think we as a global community have. Thank you.
I was so fascinated by that, I didn't actually look at my watch at all. You may or may not have been within 10 minutes.
He was keeping track.
Not to worry, not to worry. And I won't be harsh on the throwing wheels either. Manasa Aslan is managing partner at the Oxford Partnership for Education Research and Analysis, called Opera. That's what I tell them. Called Opera. So, take it away.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much. Thank you, Raj, for setting the stage and providing us what I find very depressing evidence. And I think we're going to move context now. I wanted to talk about Kenya, where I think we have some good news. So it kind of fits in what Grant has said. So what do we do when we are faced with such a crisis on such a global scale? And I think Kenya provides an example of a context where there is some emerging evidence of good news. And I wanted to talk about some papers written by Benjamin Piper and colleagues, which focus on teacher professional development and coaching, the provision of student textbooks and structured teacher guides, as well as how a program that started out as a national, at a very small scale and then became a national literacy program, how it was scaled up successfully. So I thought that these papers and the commentary for these papers has been provided by Barbara Burns, who isn't here. So I thought it was a good opportunity to be talking about this program, and I have a reason to be talking about the Tusome program, it's called. Also because I happened to be in Kenya in February for a completely different evaluation of the sister program, which is the Fight program, the numeracy program, and I've talked to stakeholders working with the Tusome program. I see the energy and the vision and the government's ownership and engagement, and I was quite fascinated by how, you know, things can actually move forward when governments are engaged and involved. So just to give you a small brief background of these two papers, they've actually found strong positive evidence from a major large-scale national reading program. They found strong positive impacts in children's literacy outcomes. Now, why is this evidence important? Going back to what Grant has just been talking about, we know that the world is facing a learning crisis, and I think Grant has talked about this, not just now, but in his own work quite extensively. We know when we look around, and there's a huge service, I believe, that surveys like USER and UESO and all have provided in highlighting the extent of this learning crisis across the globe, where children are not learning the competencies in the early years that we expect them to have achieved. That kind of translates and becomes this massive, almost vicious circle, which ultimately means that we don't have children who have attained even the basic competencies that they should have attained to move forward. And of course, underpinning the learning crisis is the teaching crisis. We have teachers who, and that takes and manifests in different forms. We have teachers, there are not enough teachers. I mean, this community sitting here knows about this probably far more than I do. We don't have enough teachers. We don't have, in countries and contexts, teachers who are well remunerated. In others where they are very well remunerated, perhaps some would argue, but not particularly motivated or incentivized. So there's a whole kind of, it's hard to identify then when we say, who do we target first? So then along come these two papers in Kenya, and I find them so useful, and Barbara's commentary on them I found particularly interesting as well, because they're not just timely, but they're also policy relevant. And many of us working here in areas where policy is key, you want to find what is it, what can we do, give me the kind of, what can I do, how do I make things move forward? So they're both invaluable contributions, and I know that there's going to be after me a discussion about how the learning crisis actually starts in the early years. And investing in the early years, in the early, perhaps some would argue in the pre-primary years or even in the very early years of primary schooling, then becomes key to address this crisis. And Lewis Crouch's work in particular resonates quite well with me, and I'm sure with many others. How the point about increasing enrollments across the developing world have meant that now you have huge numbers of children entering into the schools, and these schools don't work efficiently. They're highly inefficient and poorly functioning systems, and they are not then capable of equipping the children with good cognitive functioning. I'm terrified of this because it has fallen several times before, and Laura and I have propped it up. I hope it doesn't fall on me. So that's one of the fundamental factors. We also know that the highest primary school failure rates happen to be between grades 1 and 2. And this is despite automatic promotion policy. So the concentration of failure in early years highlights the need for schools to be ready for children and for children to be prepared for schooling. So that kind of leads into the importance of this. One of the key reasons why these papers are important, because they equip us with the message that how you can actually provide teachers, what can you do, how can you intervene to provide teachers with the right skills through, for example, in this particular context, what they found is that you provide the right training and you provide the right materials and you provide teacher guides, and that is the intervention that has helped to improve learning outcomes the most. But the second element of this, the second of these papers, which looks at the scaling up of this particular program, is also, I think, of fundamental importance. When you look at how this program that started as a pilot then ultimately became a national program. So all of us in this room are aware of the fact that even programs that are designed with the best of intentions may sometimes not ultimately result in what we had expected because of the political economy factors that ultimately influence them. So this is especially true of large-scale programs, and even more true for programs, I believe, that require behaviors to change, and particularly behaviors of teachers to change. So paradigm alterations like the Tusome program in Kenya require not just materialistic amendments, so they don't just require the provision of textbooks and system-wide changes, they actually require behaviors of teachers to change. And I think as policymakers and as academics, that is one of the things that we wonder about the most. And there are examples from around the world where very well-intentioned programs have actually failed because there was so much resistance, because teachers didn't want their behaviors to change. So in this regard, I believe that programs like Tusome would then can be seen as an anomaly from a political economy lens, because they succeed when we may not necessarily expect them to succeed. So, because we know that there are numerous studies from the developing world where you have all kinds of elements that come into play, where you have corruption and elite capture, you have limited political will, and commitment to a lack of commitment to overarching national strategies. So, what made the Tusome program a success? And Piper and all talk about that quite beautifully, I felt, in the papers. So the Tusome program exemplifies the case where I felt that one of the things that they highlight also is how the government was very willing and ready to engage. So since 2012, the government of Kenya has basically undertaken extensive efforts to transform basic literacy and numeracy in the first 2 grades of primary school. So one of the first steps of that was actually serious evaluation of a pilot program, the primer program. So they undertook very robust impact evaluations of a smaller scale program. So that serious evaluation formed the first part of that. Then based on the findings of that program, the government designed a new national literacy program. Tusome was the national literacy program and Pride was the numeracy program. And as Barbara has noted in her commentary, that quite unusually for this kind of program, the government opened up all levels of the education system to classroom observation, to data collection, and to external analysis of the quality of the implementation process. And that fundamentally meant that it was pretty much out there for everyone to see, and not just for them to see, but to also then feed back to the teachers, to the schools, to support, and then to basically result in the changes that were needed to amend the program as they went along. So to achieve system-wide changes then, what has Tusome done? They have managed to set and communicate expectations for the outcomes of education. I think that's fundamental, that everyone knows what the expectations are, and I think Lant will speak more about this based on the work that he's done. They also monitored and held schools accountable for meeting these expectations, so that was another element of it. And then they did interventions, targeted interventions to support the students and the schools that didn't meet these expectations. So in some regards then I felt that when you look at it from a political economy lens, there were various elements that aligned and worked in favor of this program. There were the right initial conditions, there was good design and setup that was based on robust impact evaluation, there was political will by the government that led to effective scale-up, and it was accompanied by system-wide changes, and there was rigorous monitoring and feedback that resulted in further success. All of these elements combined together have resulted in this program being what is now being seen as a success. And just to end, because I need to be on time, as I said, I was in Nairobi a couple of months ago for looking at the Pride program, and I managed to, as part of that, of course, because Tusome is a sister program, we managed to interview some of the stakeholders who were involved in the implementation, not just in the Ministry of Education, but also at RTI. And it was very clear that there was a great sense of ownership, and there was a great sense of the government actually feeling really proud of having based their programs on impact evaluations, and then taking a great sense of pride in those programs. And there is now recognition that Tusome will become embedded within the ministry, and so the government knows that they will have to take this forward. So actually, it was very clear that when governments have a sense of ownership and willingness, even when you don't necessarily incentivize teachers, even then you can bring about change when you would expect it not to happen, really, to some extent. So I will end on that.
As somebody born in Nairobi, I find that immensely heartening. Right. So we've now got Horacio Athanasio, who is Research Director at the Institute for Physical Studies.
Yes. Hello. I prepared some slides, but I only had them on my laptop, so I will talk without that, but that's not particularly important. So just two words of introduction about who I am and who we are. Somebody might be surprised at the IFS, which is quite visible in the policy debate here in the UK. It does work on developing countries, but in the last 10 years or so, we've been doing quite a bit of that. We have a center within the IFS called Critical Evaluation of Development Policies. And over the last 7 or 8 years, we've been doing quite a bit of work on what we call human capital, or human development and formation. We do a...
Sorry, Horacio, can I ask you to project a little harder? We've got drills behind us here. a little louder, if you would.
It's not working. Okay. So we do quite a bit of work. We have been focusing a lot on the early years, and I will talk a little bit about that. But now we also work on education in schools and past schools. In fact, we're collaborating with the RISE initiative. I decided not to talk about a specific paper or specific example. I really enjoyed the two presentations that preceded me, and they set the scheme. What I would like to do is to talk about a bit more general issues, and I will maybe refer to a couple of things. And I want to talk about 3 themes. The first one is what Lan talked about, which is the quality of schools, teaching, and the like. The second one is early years. I cannot resist to refer to some of the work I do. And the third thing refers to the previous speaker talked about the scalability evidence. So on teaching in schools, I think it's pretty clear, what's obvious from Lan's presentation, but there's also lots of other evidence from other countries, that the quality of schools, what is taught to children in developing countries is not good. And the learning curves, as they were called, are they're not very steep. Children at the end of school learn very, very little. Just to mention one, the evidence is coming out regularly from India with the ASEC run by Pradhan is as shocking as the one that Lan was referring to in Indonesia. Obviously, there is a variation. I think we still need to understand why is this happening. There are ideas, and some of them are very interesting. I think one thing that, especially in India, that's a context that I know a little bit better. The fact that lots of people's attitude within the school system is to teach to the curriculum rather than to teach to children. It's an issue. So the teacher seems to think that abilities are innate. They receive a bunch of kids. 80% of them are idiots, and therefore they cannot be taught. And they are told to teach that particular curriculum, which is going to benefit a very small fraction. And there is no adaptations, obviously that view is wrong, and we know it's wrong. But that seems to be attitude. And I think that's a very important thing. I really like the things that Renata was saying about changing attitudes and behavior of teachers, which is very difficult. And that's when we think about ways to improve the situation is something we need to address. Which brings me to the other thing that is important is to change attitudes, beliefs, knowledge, information of parents. Parental behavior is extremely important, definitely in the early years, but even later, because they do make choices, they could put or not pressure on schools and teachers. And often they do not have enough information. Just to mention a study we did recently, this is for primary schools, nursery schools in Colombia, and we managed through a number of measurements to show that what matters for child development is more what we call the quality of the processes, what happens within the school, rather than the structure. And yet, when you model the choices that parents make, which school they send the kids to, is the one with the more shiny building, because that's what they see, and unfortunately, that does not necessarily relate to the quality of the school. Which brings me to my second thing, which is the early years. The other thing that is impressive in the evidence that I've seen coming, both from developed, especially from developing countries, that the early years are incredibly important. I have data of 20 years old in Colombia, and after cognitive development at 12 months. And what they could do at 12, these are all poor, they're not rich kids, but what they could do at 12 months is a good predictor of their IQ, about earnings and things at 20. So what happens in the early years is very, very important, and therefore what parents do is very important. The second thing that we know is that what happens in the early years is very malleable. So there is scope for intervention, there is scope for action there, and the actions has to go probably through parents, and possibly a bit later on preschools. The other piece of evidence that comes out of many studies is that by age 6, poor kids in developing countries move into school with a severe disadvantage in terms of development. I have these pictures of a paper by Norbert Shadi and Christina Paxson, who shows development of Ecuadorian children from age 2 to age 6. At age 2, the poor kids, the one from the bottom quartile of the distribution, they're not in such a bad shape. But age 6, there are 3 standard deviations of the Z-score, which means 2.5 years. And these are language measures. So if you're sending a kid of age 6 with the language of a 2.5-year-old, now obviously won't learn in school. And that goes back to the issue of teaching the curriculum. If the teacher doesn't know how to address that, there's going to be a serious problem. And there, if we want to intervene into what parents do, how they stimulate their children, how they interact with them, we need to change behavior. We need to change attitudes. We need to change beliefs. And that's very, very difficult. I've been involved in a few interventions on stimulating children and encouraging parents to stimulate children. And I've in Colombia, in India, in China, and I've been into these homes. And one of the things with the curriculum, this is work that Sally Grant and McGregor has done. The curriculum encourages parents to interact and talk to the children. An answer that I heard so many times from mothers is typical thing they say is that, why would I talk to her? She doesn't understand what I say. And so there is this basic misunderstanding of the process of development, which is very, very common. And that's something we have to fight against. Which brings me to my last point, which is the scalability. So I think we know in several contexts, both early years nurseries and possibly even schools, there are interventions that can be effective. However, those, and a good thing that happened in economics and in other fields, that there's a lot of emphasis on serious evaluation. often based on randomized controlled trials where you compare a treatment with a controlled sample. And I think that has been a good progress in that respect. However, the risk is that the evidence coming from an RCT is very narrow. And it is very useful because it can tell you what works under the right conditions. But that's crucial. The under the right condition is not a footnote. It's really, really important. And so being able to implement something that can work under the right conditions, make the right conditions feasible, is very, very hard. And I think, that's the external validity of a study comes mainly from that. And so scalability is important, and it's important in several dimensions. We need to take into account the existing capacity in the field, and the abilities and the resources, human resources that are in the field. We need to take into account the necessity to get community participation and ownerships of programs. That's what I mean by changing behaviors. It means to change attitudes and beliefs in the process. It's not that the parents of poor children don't love them. They might not be aware of them. And finally, last but not least, the political economy of that, which can be very, very complicated. Think of the roles of teachers' unions in some South American countries. That can be quite complicated. And that could only compound the fact that teachers might not be aware of the right things to do. So I think we need to do quite a bit more work. When we do trials of new interventions, we need to take into account the scalability, and for that reason, we need to take into account existing programs, because they can provide the networks and that are needed to reach out at scale. And I'll stop there.
Thank you, Orazio. Well, I don't think we need to travel to Colombia to find parents who go for big and shiny rather than education. Sometimes here at home. Anyway, Suzanne Ayres, Senior Policy Fellow and Global Education Director at the Centre for Global Development.
Hi, is my mic working? So thank you to CfEE for hosting us today. I think the annual digest that's been produced and edited by Lee is really fantastic. It covers a number of brilliant papers. Lee Crawfurd, who many of you I know, in the last 6 months has moved job, house, country, and has had a new baby, so I think he's got a good excuse for not being here today. I'm particularly pleased that the digest includes contributions by CGD colleagues, by LAMP, Jishni Das, by RISE colleagues, Jishni Barbara Bruns, and reviews of papers by brilliant people like Dave Evans, Amanda Beattie, Ben Piper, Andy Zeitlin, and many others. I know there's a SOME paper that Manaza talked about has got, and Ben Piper himself has got lots of fans in the room here today, looking at you two, Ashley and Lucy. But so for the purposes of this presentation, I wanted to try to draw some parallels between education debates that are happening here in the UK and in the US and in developing countries. I was going to call this presentation Why We're Focusing Too Much on the Learning Crisis, but I thought that might lose me to some friends in the room, so I called it this instead. I'm going to talk about segregation in schools, elitism, and every British education policy person's favourite topic, which is grammar schools. I'm going to start by going back about 64 and a half years to May 1954. West Bromwich Albion had just won the FA Cup. My dad was born a couple of weeks beforehand, both pretty momentous events. But on the 17th of May, a Supreme Court ruling in Kansas became a cornerstone of the US civil rights movement. The court in Brown versus the Board of Education ruled that racial segregation of children in American public schools is unconstitutional, and it effectively established that separate but equal really isn't equal at all. As you can see from the graph, the ruling at first was relatively successful. So the chart shows the percentage of black kids in the US South who are attending schools that are at least 50% white. So before the ruling, it was almost zero. Schools were black and they were white, and no integration. And it shows that over the subsequent decades, they gradually became more integrated and less segregated. The ruling also fueled the nascent civil rights movement in the US. So just 1 year after the Brown versus the Board of Education, came the ruling, came Rosa Parks refusing to give up her seat on a bus in Montgomery in Alabama. But sadly, as you can see, it sort of peaked to around 44% in the late 1980s and then began to decline. There's a huge amount of people who've written about why this is, housing segregation, housing tax, an end to busing in many places, and crucially an end to court-mandated segregation that meant that schools started to become more, not less, integrated again. And today, fewer black kids in the South attend a school that's mostly white than they did 50 years ago. In New York, in fact, which is the most segregated state in the US, which was interesting for me to find out, 65% of black kids are in a school that's more than 90% black. So fewer African American kids are attending majority white, by which you can read better finance schools than they were. And you can also read from that when schools are released from court-mandated desegregation, progress is gradually reversed. So now in 2011, we're back to where we were in 1969. Next slide, please. And this is despite pretty compelling evidence of the impact of desegregation and the impact of more integrated schools. So Booker Johnson, in a study that was released in 2015, he followed kids that were born between 1948 and 1954, so the Brown versus Board of Education generation, if you like. He followed them all the way through to 2013. And he found that black kids had better life outcomes when they studied in integrated schools. They had better graduation rates, higher incomes, better health, lower incarceration rates, and there was no negative effect on white students who were in the same schools. Next slide, please. So moving to the UK, maybe less about race in this country, but we definitely don't do any better. So I've mislabeled this graph, apologies for that. The first graph is looking at the number of kids who are studying in grammar schools. So for those of you who don't know the UK education system, they're highly selective, state-funded schools. So in grammar schools, only 2.5% of kids are kids on free school meals out of indicator equality, whereas those kids are about 14% of the total population. So they're massively underrepresented in these highly selective schools. And in private schools, perhaps kind of less surprisingly, less than 1% of kids are on free school meals, and the vast majority are not on free school meals. That's a sort of unproven figure because private school kids in this country aren't in the National Pupil Database, but they're the sort of best estimates that we can find. Next slide, please. So what does that all mean? Well, it means there's a very, very stark gap when it comes to admissions into top universities. So the 16,000 or so students admitted into Oxford and Cambridge between 2005 and 2007, around half came from private schools, which is about 6% of the population, and less than 200 children out of 16,000 were on free school meals. So, and they represent about 14% of the population. So you can really see that the schooling system in this country is segregated, and perhaps you could call it a class, along class lines. So turning to the developing world, while segregation was getting worse in the US, India was embarking on what's perhaps the largest ever desegregation effort. The profile of schooling, as many people know, is very different in India to the US or the UK. Almost 40% of primary age kids that attend private school. And India in 2009 passed another landmark act. So the 2009 Right to Education Act mandated all private schools in India to admit 25% of their intake from the economically weaker section of society, broadly equivalent to what we would call free school meal kids in this country. And this was actually a very explicit effort by the government to increase integration and reduce social stratification. So private schools reclaim the fees for those 25% of kids from the government up to a maximum of what the government spends per child in a typical state school. And where schools oversubscribe, admissions are done through a lottery, so there shouldn't be any discrimination on ability, income, and so on. Next slide, please. Much like desegregation in the US, it's been a pretty controversial policy with vested interests in private schools lobbying hard against it and sort of various scandals around its implementation. Next slide. But has it worked? While India being the size that it is, the sort of numbers were always pretty enormous. So more than 1.5 million kids are currently in private school, with their places being funded by the government. So quite successful in terms of actually getting kids into private schools. But it's really not clear that the policy is achieving its intended objectives of educating the poorest kids. So a study by Vijay Kumar at the Vatnik School in Oxford shows that the majority of applicants for the admissions lotteries would have gone to private schools anyway, so just sort of displacing what parents would have spent. And the poorest children who should be benefiting are the ones who are still in government schools. And the effect on learning outcomes is questionable at best, shown through a number of studies, including Vijay's. No real improvement for policy-eligible children, a mild effect for girls, and a sort of slightly stronger effect on self-efficacy. But when this comes to my contribution to the digest, there is some good news. So a study that was released this year by Gautam Rao at Harvard illuminated and isolated what I think is an important and kind of heartwarming effect amid all the bad news that we hear about in global education. So Gautam Rao looked at the effect of poor kids coming into fairly elite schools in Delhi. These were genuinely poor kids coming from the bottom quartile who were going into classrooms or educating essentially the top 5% of kids in Delhi. So really poor kids coming into quite elite classrooms. And what he found is that the presence of poor kids in the classroom made their richer classmates much nicer. They were more pro-social, more generous, they were more willing to play with disadvantaged children, and this actually extended not just to the kids in their classrooms who they knew, but to kids outside the school who were strangers to them. They were nicer to those kids too. I guess I'm not an economist, but economists like this fact. They were also more likely to pick poor kids to be on their sports teams. So this behaviour kind of corrects the potentially inefficient behaviour, i.e. picking low ability rich kids over high ability poor kids is inefficient, and integration in schools reduces this inefficiency. So high ability poor kids became more likely to be chosen on cricket teams or athletic teams, and hopefully that translates into long-term life outcomes too. It also, I mean, like Rooker Johnson's study in the US, there was no negative effect on the learning outcomes of the rich kids, but it did seem like the poor kids coming into those classrooms taught their richer classmates a few new words because they swore a bit more. You can decide if that's a good or a bad effect. So I think this is a really fascinating study, and I would love someone to follow it up over the longer term to see if these effects actually do endure. Next slide. So what's the relevance of all of this discussion on integration? Well, I would argue it's actually quite relevant at the moment. There are massive public policy issues globally right now related to segregation and integration in many parts of the world, but we don't often hear it called that. So for example, refugees from Rohingya who aren't allowed to study in Bangladeshi public schools, who aren't even allowed to study Bangla as a language in Bangladesh. Syrian refugees in Jordan who are studying in separate shifts to their native schoolmates. While actually in Rwanda and Uganda, the governments have chosen to integrate refugees into public schooling systems quite deliberately, and there was an important sort of refugee integration plan launched by the First Lady of Uganda just a couple of days ago. SDG 4, which mandates countries to achieve universal secondary education, is going to require governments to face up to the fact that many secondary education systems are hugely unprogressive and elitist due to their admissions policies, and these are also often highly protected by vested interests. And as we've discussed, it's a drive to bring back grammar schools here in the UK and the resegregation of schools in the US. So I think in sort of various different ways, integration and segregation is a really relevant issue for us today. And what we see, sort of going back to developing countries, what we see is that, next slide please, what we see is that the prospects of children are still sort of very, very, very closely tied to the socioeconomic status of their parents. In the median developing economy, less than 15% of kids born into the poorest half ever make it into the top half. And I would argue, sort of partly based on the US experience and based on Gautam Rao's study, that integration can be a policy instrument to both improve learning and to improve social cohesion. And I therefore think that education policymakers need to pay more attention to it. That's not to say that addressing the learning crisis is not important, but to take one recent study, one of the authors was my colleague Justin Zanderfer at the Centre for Global Development. This was in the Partnership Schools Programme in Liberia. And that study showed that grade 2 children in the treatment group were reading about 5 words more after a year of the programme intervention. They went from reading 9 words a minute to 14 words a minute. If anyone's ever tried reading 14 words a minute, it's very, very slow, and it's definitely not reading for meaning. Obviously, you'd hope those gains would accelerate year on year, but for those of you in this room who are a parent, would you rather your kids were reading 5 more words a minute, or were much nicer kids? It shouldn't be either or. I guess more fundamentally, is reading a few more words a minute actually going to improve the life chances of poor kids? So these are kids who are from communities full of poor kids, in schools full of poor kids. Is it going to improve their life chances in any meaningful way? And I'll finish with a quote by Jishnu Das from his review of a study on social and educational mobility in the Digest. If we continue to believe that increasing learning in schools will be sufficient to enhance equity, we are kidding ourselves.
Thank you very much. Well, that's a lot to think about. I hope you've all been thinking about it. I think I'm going to close one of these windows because I don't think we can actually hear what people are going to say in the audience, and that's not going to help a lot if you want people to respond to you. Right, who would like to kick off? Lots of hands. I'm going to start, going to be very unfair here, and start with the president of the CfEE at the back. Neil.
Yes, I'm encouraged in some respects. And I certainly take what Lance has said very seriously, but there are places where they are more successful. And Rwanda is one of them, as you pointed out. And Rwanda, my previous organisation, is heavily involved in CfEE as well as now the Education Development Trust. And I'm particularly sorry they're not here today because they produced a report recently on Vietnam, which is astonishingly interesting. Vietnam, as you may know, joined PISA against the advice of all Western experts who said that they were too poor and they'd come out very badly from it. And they came out 5th out of 35 countries. 35 developed countries mostly, in science and in their first go and 5th in their second go. And moreover, they did it at the same time as raising the standards of the poorest 10% more than anybody else. So it's astonishingly interesting place. And it's worth thinking about what they've got there in their policies, which works. And in some respects, what they've got is fairly conventional, and it's Confucian, and that's of course something that other countries don't necessarily have except in East Asia. Confucius. We have Calvin in this, well not in this country, but in my country, Scotland, and he had very much the same impact on the culture of learning as Confucius does in East Asia. But anyway, they've got a state-led system, very much a state system. But it's got some features which are unusual. One feature is the degree of parental involvement, which is intense and will be roundly opposed by all the teaching unions here. The other thing they've got is that extraordinarily, at some point in the last 10 years or so, the Vietnamese government have said to their people, we can't afford to educate you all to the standards we think are necessary, so you have to put in some money yourselves. And they've got people paying voluntarily, no doubt there are social pressures, but they're paying voluntarily additional amounts according to the amount of money they earn, additional funds to the expenditure of their schools. And this is wholly opposed by everybody in the West, who advises them. And it seems to me to be highly desirable in respect of parental involvement, because it's encouraged the parental involvement, which is that you don't just have teachers, you don't just have parents in sort of governing bodies, for example. They have a parent responsible for every year group, and they have a parent responsible for every subject. And they're responsible not just for representing the views of the parents to the teachers, but representing the views of the teachers to the parents, and telling them to behave themselves as they're getting a bit excessively involved. So there are places that it works, and I have been thinking about that quite a lot recently, because I'm looking at a research proposal for a big research program, which I can't obviously tell you about, because it's, I'm the referee for it. But it depresses me enormously, because it says almost the opposite of what Vietnam has got to tell us. And what it's looking at is private tuition. And it says, rightly, that private tuition must impact on equal outcomes, but we're not going to get equal outcomes anyway. And so the implication is that we should look at this country, look at where private tuition is high in the southeast of London, maybe where it's low in Lancashire, and we should get London and the southeast to be more like Lancashire. That's the implication. That it's not very good to have private tuition, so discourage it. And that is clearly a recipe for disaster in Britain. And it's possible in education very easily to level down rather than level up. It's damn difficult to level up. Leveling down is quite easy. Because down in Scotland, 300 years of educational success, and now there.
Thank you, Neil.
Right, too long. I'm sorry. But
No, I think it was useful and interesting. I saw a hand over here. Yes, sorry.
Thank you. I enjoyed the presentation. I think I have a question for.
Oh, sorry. I should have said this already.
Should say
Your name.
My name. I'm also Professor Lucia Institute. I'm familiar with Tusome. I was there when it was conceptualized. I worked with Ben and reviewing the papers. So it's encouraging to see that actually it's achieving these results, which are fantastic. And I think, to me, my comment to that is that Tusome possibly exemplifies a situation where a bureaucratic approach to learning combined with measurement and experimentation produce results. That actually, if you just do measurement alone and experimentation and design alone, you're not going to achieve this. But if you have a bureaucratic process, and that's different from political economy, you get something. So I think that is the news I get from Tusome. And I also see Tusome as, because I know when it was started and when it was launched at the first in Nairobi, there was an element of trial and error in an evolutionary way. So Ben did this incrementally, and Ben is very persuasive, which in research we don't like. I mean, research is supposed to be neat and quick, and you get the design and it comes out. I mean, Tusome is a process that went through many stages in that bureaucratic planning approach. The question I have, though, is that when I look at Tusome, I see exactly where Uganda was when the EFA model was. Uganda was exactly the same way. It was always exemplified as a country that has implemented EFA very well. It was also a bureaucratic approach to implementation of EFA very well, but then it got stuck. It got trapped in between there and things never moved. What is the risk for Tusome in Kenya's context? And to learn, what can we learn from Uganda and from Rwanda for Lagos? Because Rwanda seems to have made it, and why is Lagos unable to replicate this kind of result?
to ask the easy questions. I'm having to take one other person, and I'm relying on the users at the top here to be thinking of these questions as we go on. Did I see a hand over there?
Hi, I'm Paul Skidmore from Rising Academies. One, I'd be interested in your take on the sort of political economy of the donors as opposed to governments. So it feels like there's some increasingly compelling evidence, at least of what doesn't work, even if we're less clear on exactly what does. And yet, when you look at what's getting funded, particularly by some of the very large donors, and I think DFID is a notable exception to this, it still feels quite old school. No pun intended, or pun intended. I'm just interested in your take on, research uptake is a terrible subject, I know, but what would it take to actually change the behaviours of the donors in relation to this?
And one more at the back.
Yeah, this one is for Susanna. Thanks for that presentation. That was really comprehensive. On the issue of school segregation, obviously from the States, I'm somewhat well versed in this. It's a very complex situation, so it has to do with like the power of state governments, similar to India, but I think that, at least from my understanding, in multiple countries, it's a very difficult policy issue because in a lot of cases you have individual parents acting what their perceived best interest is. And so there's been like lots of modifications, at least in the United States, and you keep on seeing it like reassert itself. So in some cases, people even create new school districts within a metropolitan area just to exempt themselves from these conditions. And so I guess I was just thinking if you've seen any examples from other countries where it's seen that there's kind of a flexible, well-designed policy, or they're kind of dealing with the fact that this is constantly adapting as to obey the policy. So any thoughts on that would be much appreciated.
Okay. Right. Manasa, I think you go. Yes, you go first.
Thanks, Moses. I think I don't know the answer to your question, and I appreciate your comment. I think you're absolutely right, spot on. What I can say is a couple of things that I experienced when I was in Nairobi, and my experience was only in that engagement that happened, of course, from the work that I've read. So I think that Tusome, for me, was very interesting for several reasons. First of all, I found it fascinating that it started from as you said, it was a trial and error kind of thing. It was the persuasion, and then it became bureaucratic and all of that. But I think the thing that I found very interesting was the complementarity also of the two programs, the Pride program and the Tusome program. And I found that the government was learning from Tusome and really taking on board some of them. In fact, in the offices, we also found that Tusome was really quite assisting the government function. Now, one of the risks of that, and that is something that, you know, maybe that would not even answer your question, it's not even close, but one of the risks that I think will be is what I think Justin and Tessa Gold also identified in the scaling up of handing it over from kind of like an organization and embedding it fully into a government structure, is when Tusome becomes completely part of the government structures, how that will change. So currently it's RTI, I believe, that's implementing it, and they're really helping the government implement Pride as well, but I don't know, once that becomes part of the government's internal kind of workings, how that changes the dynamics. Because from some of the interactions we found that a lot of the Pride work was actually being done by Tusome personnel as well. So, you know, which is something that the government should have been doing. So I don't know if it even comes close to answering, but point well taken.
So on the first question of what explains the variation between Rwanda and Nigeria, there's a very simple answer: we don't know. We know a bunch of things it isn't. You know, it's relatively easy to look at, you know, comparisons across countries and learning outcomes and find out that they look a lot alike in a lot of ways, that, you know, differences in expenditure per pupil in the aggregate really don't seem to explain any of the variation, which is partly why RISE is a research into improving systems of education. We think the way you put the pieces together into a system actually matters a lot more than just how many pieces there are, right? So it's sort of like a puzzle. If you get the pieces in the right place, it makes an image. Having, you know, more pieces per se isn't a benefit. But to be honest, then if we said what are those features of the system, it's hard to say, and sort of things happening at scale like Kenya reveal kind of how you can make a system move. But unfortunately, it's relatively rare actually to see systems move, and it's often common to see systems, get stuck and not kind of continue in a dynamic way. I think, I worked at a large organization called the World Bank for many years, and part of the issue is donors just are intrinsically super conservative, and they're not willing to take "we don't know" for an answer. So, everybody rightly, wants to be focused on the issue of education, and if you come to them and say, what you're doing is not working, they don't like to hear that, because they want to spend the money on education, and no one in this room particularly wants them to not spend the money on education. But that said, getting them off kind of old school stuff onto more things that are open and evolutionary and trial and error that are likely to lead to good outcomes is a very tough thing. It's often just inconsistent with the way they work. So I think the pressure has to come more on donor organizations to justify what they're doing in terms of outcomes, not inputs, in terms of real results, not just process compliance. I think we're moving that way, but again, you can tell the point of my presentation is, the kind of the easiest thing to do is build more schools and keep kids in school longer. And Indonesia is a case where they did that, and they did it at massive scale, and yet without steepening the learning profile. It just, because in the end, we know what the end game is. If the average person with secondary school complete gets 36% right, the counterfactual of what would be learning if we got everybody in secondary school? 36%, right? We know what the end game is, and yet everybody keeps rushing towards that pretty dispiriting end game, in part because I think we collectively haven't given them a way to get off of old school onto new school.
I'm not so sure we should be quite so depressed. I mean, 10, 15 years ago, they weren't in schools, full stop.
No, that's just not true.
I think it's worth looking back to the development goals.
I mean, not true of Indonesia.
No, so I'm not, more generally,
right,
is that the United Nations' original goals actually wanted to get kids into primary school in the first place, and a large number of them were. And in a sense, it's not until you actually got them into school can you ever start looking at the learning profile.
No, of course not. So, I mean, no one's doubting that. I mean,
I just thought we were getting too depressive.
But again, the point is, no one ever had a schooling goal.
No.
Because schooling is measured in terms of time served. There's only one other social process we measure in time served, right? So no one ever really had a schooling goal. We always had a learning goal. These are the capabilities we want children to emerge into their adulthood with. And so, is it a victory to push more kids through school? Yes. I mean, no one is saying not every child in the world is entitled to have access and, to primary schooling, and it's terrific. But we have to acknowledge that in a country like Nigeria, we're just pushing out. And by the way, Nigeria wasn't the worst country in the sample. I mean, Ghana, something like 6% of women who had completed grade 6 could read. I mean, it's just unbelievably bad, and so we can't be complacent. And, part of the question is, are we really on the right track in the speed and knowledge and instruments we are using to shift from expansion goals to learning goals? And I just don't think we're there yet. I don't think we're anywhere near there yet.
I'm sorry, I spoke for far too long earlier, but the problem is education is not something that can be done to or for you. It has to be done by you. And therefore the culture of aspiration is needed in the parents. And the parents maybe. I mean, my experience of developing countries is that people seem to be very aspirational. On the face of it, they seem to be very aspirational. But I wonder if they are actually for girls. And Parents are the key to it.
I'm hard of hearing, so I might not be hearing what you're saying right, but like, if you're blaming parents for these poor educational outcomes,
I'm not blaming parents at all. I mean,
that's like, poor parents are undertaking just unbelievably dramatic and heroic efforts
I know.
to get their kids in school, and the schools they are being provided are just so awful.
That's right.
It's like we can't blame them.
No, we can't blame them, but
Okay.
it's the places where it's working, there is an aspirational culture, which is, I mean, maybe it's that we should be educating the parents rather than the kids, actually.
I'm sure parents are a deep and important part of the solution. But
Sorry, can I just add, just a quick point to what to say that actually I think it is depressing, because if we look, I am from that cynical school and I want to make a point that it is depressing because if I look at, for example, the context of Pakistan where I'm from, when a child is being sent to school, it's not enough for them to be in school. It comes at a huge cost to the parents, right? The opportunity cost, that child could have been bringing an income home. They could have been looking after elderly or siblings while their parents worked more. So actually, if you start thinking of all the additional costs that end up, which are not accounted for, it is depressing that you're going, it's not enough to be in a school. You need to be getting something out of it as well, and I think it needs to be made happen.
Yeah. Right. So, 1, 2, 3. Sorry. I'm going to state right now. If you wanted to intervene, let me know. Oh, God, sorry. No, sorry. Let's stop that for a minute. Go ahead.
I also want to just, what Manasa said really resonates to me too. I think that we don't think about the amount of time of those kids that we're just wasting with them sitting through 8 years of schooling and learning nothing. There are some non-educational benefits to schooling, but the data that Lance showed is truly, truly depressing. I'm not sure we should celebrate the access victory quite as much as we do. So to Owen's question, it's a really interesting question. I think India is a fascinating natural experiment there because each of its 29 states is implementing or not implementing the policy quite differently. Vijay Kumar study that I referred to is in Karnataka. But the Accountability Initiative, which is a great organisation, has actually sort of looked at how each state did it and how effective it was across a number of different dimensions, which I think is quite interesting. I also think the way that different countries are handling refugee populations right now, so I talked a bit about Jordan and Uganda and Rwanda, we probably should do more research on that. I'm not sure there's quite enough research in this space, so that's a plug to say watch this space at CGD over the next few years.
Thank you. Right, so back to where we were. This gentleman here, that gentleman behind, and this lady in front. Around the 3. So,
John Rendell from the founder of PEAS and now an educational consultant. While the learning curves are still shallow, there remains this high private return to each year of education, and the causes of that are sort of unclear. But it's a case for access, and it's easy to say more and better is the right thing, and everyone would agree that more education and better education is the right thing. But if you make the more difficult choice of more or better, which is sometimes the more interesting policy decision to be making, where do you sit on that one?
I'm Martin Hausen from the London School of Economics. I wanted to return to this point of segregation, and especially to India. At the time when the RTE Act was coming, before that there was also discussed a different concept, it was the common school concept. So that basically abolishing the fee charge in private schools and getting all the children into the public system. Now the advantage of having this sort of system would be that the urban middle class and the politicians would have a stake in the public education system. That has not happened, obviously. There came the RTE Act with this quota system, which is not really functional. What do you think would be the impact if a common school system would be introduced? Also, considering the fact that the best schools in India are central governmental schools, actually, where the children of the public servants are going. So that the issue is not so much between private and public schools, but it shows that public schools can perform well if they are properly supported and if people who have a good educational background are also going there, and not only the children of the parents who are illiterate.
Yes.
I'm Anna from Oxford Policy Management. John Bartley stole my question, but what I hear from the panel is, I found the evidence on the flat learning profiles very compelling. At the same time, there's compelling evidence about pre-primary and how that can make those learning profiles steeper. At the same time, at the pre-primary level, you have a problem of access, right? So not that in the countries we work in, not that many children actually have access to pre-primary. So where do you stand on, and not just you, Anne, but the panel more generally, like what should we do? Should we be expanding access or should we be focusing on learning? I think it's a very poignant kind of place to apply this debate to.
That sounds very complicated. You know, let's start with perhaps the most, I don't know, they were all challenging, weren't they? Well, don't restrict yourself. Just answer everything if you feel like it as well.
I'll stick to the one that was asked me to let my better educated colleagues answer the other ones. I think it's a really good question, and I don't mean to support the RTE Act through that presentation as a concept. What I do support is the concept of integrating putting kids into the same classroom. And I think India is always a great laboratory. There have been two things that have happened recently that I think are quite instructive. One has been that the government of, I think it was UP, instructed that all of its civil servants had to start sending their kids to public schools, which is a fairly bold thing for the government to do. So any government worker
It was the High Court, actually.
It was in the High Court, and I haven't seen any results from that, but I would love someone to research it if it ever did happen. I agree with you. I think the best way to make schools better is to get the middle classes to send their kids to those schools. Is what we see happen in this country, and what you see in almost every developing country is just increasing elitism. So rich kids go to one-step schools and poor kids go to another-step schools. And I think then, just to sort of validate one of the points that you made, where you have seen really strong efforts to improve public schools, you have seen a reverse of the, what does Michael Barber call it, the voting with their feet. People have actually left private schools and come back to public schools in a few isolated places in India. So that's kind of encouraging to me, because it doesn't say that people are actually choosing ideologically as parents between public and private. They're trying to choose the best education for their kids, which all of us will try to do. And if you do improve the public system, you should potentially be able to attract those parents and those kids back again.
Thank you.
So I don't think, and this is odd for an economist to say, but there's not a trade-off. It's like these countries are so incredibly inside the production frontier of what would be possible if they managed to emphasize and organize themselves to do it, that the idea that we're on the PPF of the production possibility frontier and we have to choose between more or better is just false. These countries could do more and better if they really set their mind to do it and they really had instruments that they were disposed in which they could do trial and error and have locally owned progress. So I think, that said, I think the international community communicating to the world and to the individual countries that more and more alone is enough, I think is a really dangerous message to continue to send, because it's just not. Like, if you look and say, what are the capabilities that are emerging from secondary school with now, it's just not enough to argue that in most countries in the world they emerge from the secondary school at the current learning profiles anywhere near equipped for the life they're going to face as adults. So I think the more only message, I think, is a very dangerous message.
The same is true on the other side as well.
Other side of
the better only, which
I
is
I think that's not true, because in most countries in the world, every kid is in fact starting school. I mean, the net enrollment rate of children, the current number of fraction of all children who ever attend school has reached 97%. So again, there's just nothing left at the expansion margin for improving aggregates. There's just nothing left in most countries in the world. Sure, there's some Sahelian countries and some conflict countries, and that's super important. But that, we're talking about billions of children and tens of millions of children in those situations. So I'm super, yeah, more should be done about that. But let's not kid ourselves that there's anything left on the expansion margin.
So that's it, and then I'll let you come back.
Yeah, because it's endogenous. Meaning, there's nothing left on the expansion margin because most kids who don't finish school because the school they're in is so crappy they want out of it. So it's not as if access remains an issue. So even of the non-enrolled kids, access just isn't the primary issue.
Okay,
By
I
definition.
need to come up.
No, I would like to support what Blank was saying. I think the big challenge, the way I see it, is to find is the better, because in lots of places the structure is there, but it's empty or is filled with the wrong stuff, and it's very difficult to change the way teachers do their stuff, change the parents participate, and all that. I think that's the big challenge. If you ask me, is definitely better. More, yeah, maybe in some situations, but overall, in India we are doing a big project in Orissa. Children in our villages, 192 of them, children 3 to 5, 98% attend nurseries, the annual one centers. They don't do anything there, but that's the access there. Can I just add one question or comment to something that Susan said? I think the stuff on segregation is really interesting and stuff, but I would be very careful in saying desegregation is necessarily better. When you cited the Brown, the U.S. desegregation, there are recent studies that points out that outcomes for Afro-American youth might have been worsened by that. As a consequence of that, lots of black teachers were fired. So lots of black kids, they went to desegregated schools, but they were taught not by black teachers, but by white teachers, with the level of discrimination that implies. And there is some strong, the number of black teachers decreased by 18,000, I think, if I remember well. And there are some outcomes that show that not necessarily. I'm not saying that segregated schools could have been better, but desegregation alone not necessarily comes with,
I think you have to take a broad definition of desegregation or integration between teachers and children. I agree.
Is there anything?
Nodding your head. Did you want to pile in at this point?
No, I just want to add that I think that if I look at, I'm most familiar with the context of Pakistan, I think I would say that without improving the schooling system, providing more and more is not going to be enough, because what it will do is that it will result in children dropping out, and that would be more inefficient in my view. And for example, girls, and it all brings it down to culture. So you have provided a school, but if it doesn't have the right conditions, it doesn't have a boundary wall, for example, in an extremely conservative area, you're not going to end up retaining those children. So there's no point in. And Punjab, for example, is a classic example of pushing for enrollment increases, and they have. But then we're seeing in the data that these huge numbers were dropping out. So actually, it's all well and good to say we increased enrollment, but without having the right quality of schools, you're not going to retain those children. So what's the point of?
Is there anything that we can learn from Vietnam?
Sorry, Neil, you've had your crack. Sorry, I know we're getting close to finish time, but I did you want to just come back?
Well, I just wanted to clarify whether, so in sectors where we're not at the expansion now, so in pre-primary you've got 37% net enrollment in Rwanda and 27% in Liberia, for example. And then it seems like what Manaz is suggesting is that you need to do both, but focus on the better. What would you say? Like both access and learning, but